faceless ones. Jacob Wells was not just a photographer, he was an artist with a lens. A man who captured the world in its most intimate moments. His portfolio brimmed with hauntingly beautiful images. Lonely streets at dawn, forgotten playgrounds, and faces that told stories with every wrinkle and scar. But Jacob's obsession with photography was more than just a passion. It was his escape from the mundane realities of life. He lived for the thrill of finding that perfect shot, that fleeting moment when everything aligned. But as the old saying goes, some things are better left undiscovered. The tale of Jacob Wells is not one of success and acclaim, but a story steeped in shadows. A descent into a world where reality blurs with nightmare, and the price of perfection is a curse that slowly strips away one's very identity. Jacob's life took a strange turn on the day he stumbled upon an old, forgotten gallery on the outskirts of the city. It was a dreary afternoon, the kind where the sun seemed to struggle against the overcast sky, casting the world in a dull, lifeless gray. Jacob had been wandering, searching for inspiration when he saw it. A small, almost decrepit building, half hidden by ivy and time. The sign above the door was faded, the words barely legible. Evershade Photography Gallery. Curiosity led him inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of age. The walls were lined with photographs, each more unsettling than the last. There were no titles, no names. Just images that seemed to stare back at him, as though the subjects within were aware of his presence. Among them was one photograph that stood out. It was a simple black and white portrait of a man, but something about it felt wrong. The man's face was perfectly smooth, devoid of any features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty, featureless face. Jacob couldn't tear his gaze away. He was both repulsed and fascinated. A voice from the shadows startled him. "It's called." "The Faceless One," said a tall, thin man who seemed to materialize from the darkness. He introduced himself as Vincent, the gallery's curator, and explained that the photograph was part of an ancient collection, said to capture the souls of its subjects. "Be careful," Vincent warned with a cryptic smile. "Sometimes the things we capture have a way of capturing us." But Jacob, ever the skeptic, dismissed the warning as mere superstition. He was more interested in the photograph itself. Its perfect composition, the eerie stillness it conveyed. Without thinking, he made an offer to buy it. Vincent hesitated, but seeing Jacob's determination, he eventually agreed. With the photograph in hand, Jacob felt a strange sense of exhilaration. He had found something truly unique. Something that would elevate his work to new heights. But as he left the gallery, a cold chill ran down his spine, as though unseen eyes were watching him, waiting. Back in his apartment, Jacob wasted no time in setting up the photograph. He hung it in his studio, directly across from his work desk, where he could study it while editing his latest shots. But the more he looked at it, the more unsettled he became. The faceless figure seemed to change, its outline shifting ever so slightly, as if it were moving within the frame. At night, the room felt colder, and shadows stretched longer than they should, pooling in corners like dark puddles of ink. Soon, Jacob began to see the faceless figure in his own work. At first, it was subtle. A blurred shape in the background, an anomaly that could be dismissed as a trick of the light. But with each passing day, the figure became more distinct, appearing in places it couldn't possibly be. In one photo, it stood among a crowd in a bustling market. In another, It loomed behind a child playing in the park. And always, its faceless head seemed to be turned towards the camera, as if aware of Jacob's presence behind the lens. Sleep eluded him. When he did manage to doze off, his dreams were plagued by the faceless figure. In those dreams, it would reach out to him, its hands thin and pale, like the branches of a dead tree. It would try to touch him, to pull him into the darkness from which it came. Jacob would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the echo of a camera shutter ringing in his ears. He started to withdraw from his friends and family. His best friend, David Ross, noticed the change first. "You've been acting strange, Jake," he said one evening over a drink at their usual bar. "You're obsessed with that damn photo. It's not healthy." But Jacob brushed off his concerns, chalking it up to stress and lack of sleep. He couldn't tell David the truth, that the faceless figure was haunting him, that it was creeping into his life, into his very mind. No one would believe him. Even Jacob, in his more rational moments, doubted his own sanity. Yet, the evidence was irrefutable. The faceless figure was real. It was in his photos, his dreams, his home. And it was getting closer. One morning, Jacob awoke to a strange stillness in his apartment. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. He walked into his studio and froze. The photograph of the faceless man was gone. In its place was an empty frame, the glass cracked as though something had forced its way out. Panicking, Jacob searched every inch of his apartment, but the photograph was nowhere to be found. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had moved it and forgotten. Maybe someone had broken in. But deep down, he knew the truth. The faceless one had escaped. That day, Jacob couldn't bring himself to work. He felt a growing unease, as if the world itself was shifting around him. His thoughts were clouded, his sense of time distorted. Hours passed in a blur, and when evening came, he realized he had missed an important meeting with his mother, Margaret. He called her, but there was no answer. Worried, he drove to her house, only to find it empty. The lights were off, the doors slightly ajar. Inside, everything was in its place. Except for Margaret. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Jacob searched the house, calling her name, but there was no response. He tried the neighbors, but none had seen her. Frantic, he contacted the police, but their search turned up nothing. Margaret Reed had disappeared without a trace. In the days that followed, Jacob noticed something strange. He couldn't remember what his mother looked like. Her face, once so familiar, was now a blur in his mind. He couldn't recall her voice, her smile, the way she always wore that old cardigan on cold evenings. It was as if she had never existed. And then the final blow came. When Jacob tried to find photographs of his mother, he discovered that she was missing from all of them. Every photo where she should have been was empty. The space where she stood now a void, as if she had been erased from existence. Desperation drove Jacob to seek answers. He remembered the strange curator, Vincent, and returned to the Evershade Gallery, only to find it abandoned, the building condemned and boarded up. It was as if it had been that way for years. Feeling lost, Jacob turned to the only other source of information he could think of. Professor Alan Marshall, an eccentric scholar of the occult, whom he had once interviewed for a photography project. Marshall was a recluse, living in a cluttered old house filled with ancient books and relics. When Jacob told the professor about the faceless figure, Marshall grew pale. "The faceless ones," he whispered, "they are more than just cursed spirits. They are erasers of existence. They feed on identity, on the very essence of a person, until there is nothing left. Marshall explained that the faceless ones were drawn to those who tried to capture the world in art. Photographers, painters, writers. They were jealous of those who could create, for they themselves were empty, void of identity. The photograph Jacob had purchased was a gateway, a trap set by the faceless ones to draw new victims. There may be a way to stop them, Marshall said, though his voice lacked conviction. But it's dangerous, and there's no guarantee it will work. That night, Jacob returned to his apartment, more afraid than ever. As he prepared to confront the faceless ones, he was visited by the ghost of Lydia Park. She appeared in his bedroom mirror, her face obscured by a veil, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They took everything from me," she said. "I was once like you, a photographer with a gift. But they took my face, my identity, and left me as nothing more than a shadow." Lydia's ghost offered Jacob a warning and a choice. He could confront the faceless ones, but it would come at a great cost. The curse was nearly impossible to break, and those who tried often lost themselves in the process. Before Jacob could respond, Lydia vanished, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the growing dread that the faceless ones were closing in. The faceless ones were relentless. They appeared more frequently, not just in Jacob's photographs, but in reflections, in the shadows that crept across his walls, in the silence of the night. He could feel them watching, waiting for the moment when he would finally break. Jacob knew he couldn't run from them any longer. He had to confront the curse head-on, to face the faceless ones, and find a way to reclaim his life before it was too late. But how? The answer came to him in a dream. In the dream, he was back in the gallery, standing before the empty frame where the photograph had once hung. But this time, the frame was a mirror, and in the reflection, he saw not his own face, but the face of the faceless one. It was then that he understood. He would have to capture the faceless one in a photograph, trapping it in the same way it had trapped others. The next day, Jacob gathered his equipment and waited for nightfall. The apartment was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. As the clock struck midnight, the faceless one appeared, stepping out of the shadows like a ghostly wraith. Jacob's hands trembled as he raised his camera, focusing on the figure. The faceless one moved closer, its presence suffocating, oppressive. But Jacob held his ground, waiting for the right moment, the perfect shot. Finally, the faceless one was within reach. Jacob took the shot, the camera flash illuminating the room for a brief moment. But instead of capturing the faceless one, the photograph showed only darkness. An empty void, where the figure should have been. Panic set in. The faceless one was still there, looming over him, its featureless face inches from his own. It reached out with cold, skeletal hands, and Jacob knew then that he had failed. The faceless one was not just a ghost. It was an embodiment of the void, of emptiness itself. It couldn't be captured, because it was nothingness incarnate. In that moment, Jacob understood the true horror of the curse. The faceless one wasn't after his soul or his life. It was after his identity, his very existence. And as it touched him, Jacob felt himself fading. His memories, his sense of self, slipping away like sand through his fingers. Days passed, but Jacob could no longer tell how many. Time had become meaningless, a blur of gray. The faceless ones were everywhere now, surrounding him, whispering to him in voices that weren't voices. He was losing himself, becoming one of them. Faceless, forgotten, erased. his friends, his family. None of them remembered him anymore. He was a ghost, a shadow, a nameless entity drifting through a world that had moved on without him. And with each passing day, he faded a little more, until there was nothing left. The final blow came when he looked into a mirror and saw nothing staring back at him, not even a shadow. Just empty space. He was gone, his existence erased as if he had never been. The story of Jacob Wells is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of obsession, of the fine line between art and madness. It teaches us that some things are better left untouched, that the pursuit of perfection can sometimes lead us down a path from which there is no return. But more than that, it is a lesson in the importance of identity, of knowing who we are and holding on to that, even in the face of darkness. For without our identity, we are nothing more than faceless shadows, lost in the void. And in the end, isn't that the true horror? The idea that we could be forgotten, erased, our very existence wiped away as if we had never been. So, if you ever find yourself staring into a mirror and you don't recognize the face looking back at you, remember the story of Jacob Wells. Remember the faceless ones, and be careful not to lose yourself to the darkness. Because once you do, there's no coming back. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.